Tomorrow I'm filing for divorce. My husband said it the same way most people might announce they were changing cable companies. Matter of fact. Calm. Certain. It was 6:12 on a Tuesday morning in March. I remember because the digital clock on our microwave glowed bright green behind him while I stood at the kitchen counter pouring coffee. Outside our Columbus, Ohio home, the sky was still gray. The maple tree in our backyard hadn't started budding yet. Winter was hanging on longer than usual. Greg sat at the table scrolling through his phone. 31 years of marriage. And that's how he chose to end it. Not with a conversation. Not with honesty. Not even with basic respect. Just a statement. A decision already made. He took a sip of coffee and added, "I've already talked to an attorney." I set the coffee pot down. The strange thing was I wasn't shocked. 6 months earlier I probably would have cried. Maybe begged him to explain. Maybe blamed myself. But not that morning. That morning I quietly walked to the pantry. I reached behind a stack of paper towels, pulled out a thick manila folder, and slid it across the table toward him. "What's this?" he asked. "Go ahead." For the first time all morning he actually looked at me. Then he opened it. I watched the confidence disappear from his face, not all at once. Slowly. Like air leaking from a tire. His eyes moved across the pages. Then back again. He flipped faster. A few seconds later, he stood so abruptly his chair nearly tipped backward. "What is this?" "You know exactly what it is." His jaw tightened. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he grabbed the folder and headed toward the garage. A minute later I heard the side door slam. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pacing beside his truck while talking frantically on his cell phone. No doubt calling the attorney he'd just bragged about. I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug. It should have felt satisfying. It didn't. Not completely. Mostly I felt tired. The kind of tired that settles into your bones after carrying something heavy for too long. Because that folder hadn't appeared overnight. It had taken 6 months to build. 6 months of questions. 6 months of fear. 6 months of learning things about my husband that I never wanted to know. And it all started with a single bank statement. Back then, life looked normal. Or at least normal enough. I was 58 years old and recently retired after working nearly 3 decades as a secretary at an elementary school on the west side of Columbus. Our 2 children were grown. Emily lived outside Cleveland with her husband and 2 boys. Ryan worked in Indianapolis. Greg owned a small consulting company. Nothing fancy. He advised manufacturing businesses throughout Ohio and neighboring states. For years, our routine barely changed. He traveled. I managed things at home. We attended church most Sundays, hosted Thanksgiving, babysat grandkids when we could. From the outside, we looked like every other long-married couple on our street. Looking back now, I realize how much of my life operated on trust. I trusted Greg to handle investments. I trusted him to pay taxes. I trusted him when he said everything was under control. One afternoon in September, I stopped by our local branch of Huntington Bank. Nothing unusual. I just needed a replacement debit card. While waiting, the young banker asked if I'd like printed copies of our recent account activity. "Sure," I said. That simple decision changed everything. Later that evening, I sat at the kitchen island reviewing transactions. Most were familiar. Utilities, groceries, insurance. Then I noticed a transfer. $38,000. I stared at the number. Maybe it was a business expense. Maybe I was missing something. I waited until Greg got home. "What's this transfer?" I asked casually. He barely glanced at it. "Oh, business investment." "What kind?" "Nothing important." That answer bothered me. Not because of the money. Because of how quickly he dismissed the question. We had never hidden financial matters from each other. At least I thought we hadn't. A few weeks later I saw another transfer. Then another. Each one larger than the last. Every explanation felt vague. Every answer came faster. Almost rehearsed. One night I mentioned it again. Greg put down his fork. "Linda, do you trust me or not?" I remember feeling embarrassed. Like maybe I was being unreasonable. So I dropped it. For a while. But something kept nagging at me. The numbers didn't make sense. Neither did his behavior. He guarded his phone more closely. Started taking calls outside. Claimed he needed more overnight business trips. Little things. Tiny pieces that didn't fit together. The first person I told was my friend Sharon. We'd known each other since our daughters played softball together back in the 90s. Every Thursday morning we met at a Bob Evans near Hilliard. Coffee, breakfast, gossip, life. That October I finally told her everything. She listened quietly, then set down her fork. "Linda." "What?" You already know something's wrong. I stared at my coffee. I don't want to believe that. I know. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then she said something I never forgot. Trust doesn't mean refusing to look at facts. That sentence stayed with me all the way home. A week later, I started gathering records. Not because I wanted revenge. Not because I wanted a divorce. Because I needed answers. What I found would eventually fill an entire folder. The same folder now sitting in Greg's trembling hands. Outside, I watched him pacing beside his truck. His voice grew louder. His movements sharper. The attorney on the other end of that call was probably hearing information Greg never expected anyone else to discover. And the truth was, I still hadn't uncovered the worst of it. Not yet. Because 2 weeks after I began digging through our finances, I found a charge on a credit card statement. A charge connected to a name I had never seen before. Melissa. At the time, I had no idea who she was. But before long, that name would change everything. For the next few weeks, I lived a strange double life. On the surface, everything looked normal. I made dinner, folded laundry, called my grandsons on Sunday afternoons. Greg came and went like he always had. If anyone had looked through our front window, they would have seen an ordinary married couple approaching retirement. But underneath that routine, something had changed. I was paying attention, really paying attention. And once I started looking, things appeared that I'd somehow missed for years. One evening in late October, Greg told me he had a 2-day consulting trip in Cincinnati. Nothing unusual. He traveled often. But when he left, I noticed he had packed one of his newer sport coats. The navy one he normally reserved for weddings or special dinners. Not exactly standard business trip attire. I almost laughed at myself for noticing. Then I stopped laughing. Because I was noticing everything now. That weekend, I sat at my laptop in the guest bedroom and reviewed more financial records. I wasn't particularly good with money. Greg had always handled the complicated stuff. But retirement had given me plenty of time. And YouTube tutorials are surprisingly helpful when you're a determined 58-year-old woman trying to understand bank statements. Little by little, patterns began to emerge. The transfers weren't random. They all went through a business account connected to Greg's consulting company. From there, the money moved elsewhere. The amounts varied. $10,000, $15,000, $22,000. But the destination account appeared repeatedly. I copied every transaction into a notebook. Dates, amounts, account numbers, everything. The more I documented, the less accidental it looked. One Thursday morning, Sharon slid into her booth at Bob Evans and immediately knew something was wrong. You found something? I nodded. A lot. She took a sip of coffee. How bad? I stared out the window at the parking lot. Worse than I expected. I showed her several pages from my notebook. She read quietly, then whistled. That's a lot of money. Yep. What are you going to do? I don't know. And that was the truth. I wasn't gathering information because I had some grand plan. I wasn't plotting revenge. Honestly, I still hoped there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe not a good explanation. But something, anything. The problem was that every new discovery made that possibility less likely. Around Thanksgiving, another clue appeared. This one came completely by accident. I was looking for an old recipe on our shared iPad when a text notification popped up. The message disappeared almost instantly, but not before I saw enough. Can't wait to see the townhouse. Townhouse. I stared at the screen. My stomach tightened. A few minutes later, another message arrived. This one included a first name, Melissa, the same name I'd already seen on the credit card statement. For several minutes, I simply sat there. The kitchen felt strangely quiet. The refrigerator hummed. The dishwasher clicked. Normal sounds. Normal house. Nothing felt normal anymore. That night, I barely slept. Part of me wanted to confront him immediately. Part of me was terrified of the answer. 31 years is a long time. When you've built a life with someone, your mind naturally searches for excuses. Maybe it wasn't what it looked like. Maybe there was another Melissa. Maybe there was another townhouse. The human brain can invent a lot of stories when it's afraid. Unfortunately, facts are less creative. A week later, I found the property records. Public records are easier to access than many people realize, especially when a determined retired school secretary has plenty of free time. The townhouse existed, outside Cincinnati, purchased 3 months earlier. The owner wasn't Greg. It was Melissa Turner, but several financial transactions connected directly back to his business account. I printed everything, added it to the folder. Then I cried. Not dramatically, not like in movies. I simply sat at the dining room table and cried quietly for about 20 minutes. Because at that moment, the situation stopped being suspicious. It became real. The affair wasn't the hardest part. Oddly enough, the hardest part was realizing how many lies had been required to maintain it. Every business trip, every late meeting, every excuse, every casual conversation. Thousands of small decisions, all built on deception. By Christmas, Greg seemed more relaxed than ever, almost cheerful. That should have bothered me. Instead, it became oddly helpful. People who think they've gotten away with something often become careless. Greg became very careless. One Saturday morning, he lectured me about spending money. Actually lectured me. I was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing Black Friday purchases. Nothing extravagant. A few gifts for the grandkids. A new coffee maker. Some winter clothes. Greg looked over the credit card statement and frowned. We need to be more disciplined financially. I nearly choked on my coffee. More disciplined. The man secretly funding another woman's townhouse was criticizing my coffee maker. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. You think so? I asked. Absolutely. Then he launched into a 10-minute speech about budgeting. That night after he went to bed, I discovered he had paid nearly $4,000 for a luxury spa resort weekend in Kentucky. Apparently, financial discipline had exceptions. Sharon laughed so hard when I told her that story she nearly spilled her coffee. I shouldn't laugh, she said. But that's ridiculous. It really is. At least he's making your lawyer's job easier. At that point, I didn't even have a lawyer. But Sharon planted the idea. Maybe it was time. Maybe gathering evidence wasn't enough anymore. Maybe I needed professional advice. The appointment happened in January. A small law office near downtown Columbus. Nothing fancy. Just a practical attorney named David Reynolds who looked old enough to remember rotary phones. I liked him immediately. He listened without interrupting, reviewed the documents, asked questions, took notes. After nearly an hour, he leaned back in his chair. Mrs. Harper. Yes. How much does your husband know you've discovered? Nothing. He nodded slowly. Good. That single word surprised me. Good. Not terrible. Not hopeless. Good. For the first time in months, I felt a tiny sense of control. Then David said something that changed the direction of everything. Based on these records, I don't think he's preparing for a normal divorce. My stomach dropped. What do you mean? He slid several documents toward me. These transfers appear designed to reduce visible marital assets. I stared at him. The meaning arrived slowly, like cold water spreading across a floor. Greg wasn't simply having an affair. He wasn't simply hiding money. He was preparing, planning, positioning himself. David pointed toward the numbers. If this continues, he may attempt to claim far fewer assets exist than actually do. I felt sick. 31 years together. And this man was quietly arranging a future where I would walk away with almost nothing. When I got home, I sat alone in the driveway for nearly 20 minutes. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my hands. Inside the house, Greg was watching television, laughing at some sitcom, looking completely relaxed. For the first time, I stopped wondering whether there had been a misunderstanding. There wasn't. And although I didn't know it yet, an even bigger secret was still waiting beneath everything I'd already uncovered. A secret that would eventually leave even Greg's own attorney speechless. The first time my attorney used the word fraud, I honestly thought he was being dramatic. I was sitting across from David Reynolds in his office on a rainy Thursday afternoon in February. The windshield wipers had barely kept up during the drive downtown. My shoes were still damp from the parking lot. And suddenly this quiet, practical attorney was talking about fraud. Let's slow down, I said. David slid a document across his desk. Take a look at the signature. I stared at it. At first glance, it looked like mine. The same looping L. The same H in Harper. The same general shape, but something felt off. I picked it up, studied it, then studied it again, and my stomach dropped. Oh my God. David nodded. You see it? That's not my signature. No. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. The document was tied to a business loan Greg had secured years earlier. Supposedly, I had signed as part of the financial documentation. Except I hadn't. Not ever. I remembered the year clearly. Ryan had just graduated college. My father had been recovering from heart surgery. I would have remembered signing loan paperwork, especially paperwork involving hundreds of thousands of dollars. But I hadn't, because Greg had signed it himself, or paid someone else to do it. Either way, it wasn't me. I felt physically cold, not angry. Not yet. Just cold. Like the floor beneath me had suddenly disappeared. For months I'd been uncovering lies. This was different. This wasn't a lie. This was something much bigger. David opened another file. Unfortunately, he wasn't finished. There appears to be more. I closed my eyes. Of course there was. Over the next 30 minutes, he walked me through additional documents. Retirement-related paperwork, investment records, financial disclosures. Several carried signatures that supposedly belonged to me. Several definitely did not. By the time he finished, I felt exhausted. The worst part wasn't the legal implications. It was realizing how completely I had trusted Greg. I wasn't naive. I wasn't foolish. I simply believed my husband. For over 3 decades, and that trust had apparently become a tool he used whenever it benefited him. When I got home, Greg was sitting in the family room watching a basketball game. Ohio State was losing. He looked annoyed. For a brief moment, I stood in the doorway and studied him. The familiar face, the gray hair, the reading glasses, the man who had once stayed awake all night when Emily had pneumonia, the man who taught Ryan how to ride a bicycle, the man I had loved, and somehow also the man who had done all this. That contradiction hurt more than anything. "How was your day?" he asked. Normal voice, normal question, like nothing had changed. "Fine," I said. Then I walked upstairs. That night I barely slept. Not because I was planning revenge. Because I was grieving. People talk about divorce like it's a single event. It isn't. It's a series of losses. The marriage, the future you imagined, the person you thought you knew. Each realization arrives separately, and each one hurts in its own way. For several days I considered walking away from everything. Seriously. Just ending the marriage quietly. No battle. No confrontation. No public embarrassment. Just freedom. The problem was that Greg wasn't offering freedom. He was actively trying to leave me financially devastated. That made the decision harder and easier. Around that same time, something unexpected happened. Something that completely changed the story. I received an email. At first, I almost deleted it. The sender's name looked familiar. Then I realized why. Melissa Turner. I stared at the screen. My pulse immediately sped up. For several minutes, I debated whether to open it. Finally, I clicked. The message was surprisingly short. "Linda, you don't know me personally, but I think we need to talk. I recently learned some things about Greg that you deserve to know. If you're willing, I'd like to meet. Melissa." That was it. No explanation. No details. Just 7 sentences. I immediately forwarded it to David. Then I called Sharon. You won't believe this. 20 minutes later, we were sitting in our usual booth at Bob Evans. Sharon read the email twice, then a third time. "What are you thinking?" "I don't know." "Do you trust her?" "Absolutely not." Sharon nodded. Good answer. A week later, after discussing it with David, I agreed to meet Melissa. Public place, daytime. A coffee shop in Westerville. I arrived early. My nerves were a mess. Part of me expected a glamorous younger woman, the kind people imagine when they hear the word affair. Instead, Melissa looked tired. Really tired. She sat across from me, clutching a coffee cup with both hands. For several awkward seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she sighed. "I didn't know." I stared at her. "What?" I didn't know the truth. Over the next hour, an entirely different picture emerged. Greg hadn't merely lied to me. He had lied to her too. According to Melissa, he'd spent years describing our marriage as essentially over. Separate lives, separate finances, only staying together temporarily. All lies. Then came the bigger revelation. Melissa believed Greg planned to marry her. Eventually. That's what he'd promised. The townhouse, the financial support, the future. Everything had been built around that promise. Then she discovered evidence that Greg was involved with yet another woman. Not me, not Melissa, someone else. At that point, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so absurd. The man had apparently been running multiple versions of the same story simultaneously. Melissa shook her head. "I feel stupid." "You shouldn't." "I should have asked more questions." "So should I." For the first time all afternoon, she smiled. A small smile. Sad but genuine. We spent nearly 2 hours comparing information. Dates, trips, financial records, stories he'd told both of us. The overlap was unbelievable. By the end, one fact became painfully clear. Neither of us had ever truly known Greg. When I left the coffee shop, I sat in my car for several minutes, processing everything. The affair wasn't the biggest story anymore. Neither was the hidden money. The real story was deception. Years and years of it. Then 3 weeks later, Greg made the mistake that ultimately destroyed him. He announced a family dinner. A large one. Children, relatives, friends, business associates, everyone. According to Emily, he planned to explain the situation. The phrase alone made me nervous. I knew exactly what that meant. Greg wasn't preparing for a conversation. He was preparing a performance. And based on everything I'd learned, I already knew who he intended to cast as the villain. What Greg didn't know was that I wasn't walking into that dinner alone. Not this time. And before the night was over, every carefully constructed lie he'd spent years building was about to collapse in front of everyone who mattered. By the time the family dinner arrived, I hadn't slept properly in 3 nights. Not because I was afraid of Greg anymore, because I knew exactly what was coming. And if I'm being honest, I wasn't looking forward to any of it. People love revenge stories because they imagine some perfect moment where everything falls into place. Real life doesn't work that way. Even when you're right, confrontation is uncomfortable, especially when it involves people you've known for decades. The dinner was scheduled for Saturday evening at a private room inside a steakhouse near downtown Columbus. One of those places with dark wood walls, leather booths, and waiters who always seem slightly disappointed in you. Greg had reserved the room himself. That should have been my first clue. The man loved an audience. I arrived 10 minutes early. My hands were shaking slightly as I parked. For a second, I considered turning around. Just leaving. Driving home. Watching television. Pretending none of this existed. Then I remembered the last 6 months. The lies. The planning. The money. The signatures. And I walked inside. The hostess directed me toward the private dining room. When I entered, nearly everyone was already there. Emily and her husband. Ryan. Several cousins. Greg's brother Mark. His sister Diane. A few longtime family friends. Even 2 business associates from his consulting company. The room immediately grew quiet. Not completely silent. Just that awkward kind of quiet people create when they know something uncomfortable is happening. Emily stood and hugged me. "Are you okay?" Yes, it wasn't entirely true. But it was close enough. Greg sat near the center of the room. Naturally, the position gave him maximum visibility. He smiled when he saw me. The same practiced smile I'd seen for years. Only now I recognized it differently. As performance. Not sincerity. Dinner began normally enough. Orders were taken. Drinks arrived. People discussed grandchildren, weather, summer travel plans. Nobody mentioned divorce, at least not yet. I noticed Greg checking his watch repeatedly, waiting, preparing. About halfway through the meal, he finally stood. A fork clinked against a plate somewhere. The room quieted, and the show began. "First, thank you all for coming." He gave a small smile. "I know some of you have questions." "No kidding. I wanted to address things personally." I glanced toward Sharon. She sat near the back, calm as ever. Her expression never changed. Greg cleared his throat, then launched into what was clearly a rehearsed speech. He talked about difficult marriages, growing apart, life changes, challenges. Then gradually, very carefully, he began building a narrative. A narrative where he was the patient husband, the reasonable one, the responsible one. And I was the problem, not directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, he used implication, suggestions, little comments designed to guide people toward conclusions. Sometimes people stop participating in the relationship. Pause. Sometimes one person has to carry most of the responsibility. Pause. Sometimes difficult financial decisions become necessary. I almost admired the strategy. Almost. It was manipulative, but skillfully manipulative. Several guests nodded sympathetically, exactly as he'd hoped. Then he took it one step further. "I've done everything I could." There it was, the victim speech, a masterpiece of selective storytelling. According to Greg, he'd sacrificed endlessly while dealing with a wife who simply couldn't move forward. I watched people absorb it. Some looked uncertain, others looked convinced. That part hurt more than I expected. Even when you know the truth, it's painful watching people believe lies about you. For a moment, I felt myself shrinking. The old version of me. The one who avoided conflict. The one who kept peace at all costs. The one Greg expected to see. Then something unexpected happened. Ryan spoke. My son had remained quiet all evening. Now he leaned forward. "Dad," Greg smiled. "Yes." "When exactly did you decide Mom was the problem?" The room shifted immediately. Subtle, but noticeable. Greg laughed awkwardly. "That's not what I'm saying." "It kind of sounds like what you're saying." Several heads turned. Greg's smile tightened. I felt a surge of gratitude toward my son. Not because he was defending me, because he was forcing honesty into a conversation built on dishonesty. Greg attempted to recover, but the rhythm had changed. The room was no longer fully under his control, which meant it was finally my turn. I stood, slowly. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. For a second, nobody moved. Then I reached into my bag and removed several envelopes, the same documents David and I had carefully organized. The room watched silently. "What are those?" Greg asked. I looked directly at him. Context. A few nervous laughs appeared around the room. Not many, just enough. I began handing out copies, one envelope to Mark, one to Diane, one to Emily, one to Ryan, several more to family friends. Greg's face immediately lost color. He knew. Before anyone even opened them, he knew. "What are you doing?" he asked. I ignored him. Pages rustled. People started reading. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Bank transfers, property records, financial timelines, business account activity. Nothing exaggerated, nothing emotional, just facts. The most devastating kind of evidence. I watched expressions change one by one. Confusion, surprise, disbelief, then realization. Mark looked up first. "What the hell is this?" Greg swallowed. "It's being taken out of context." Mark flipped another page. $38,000. No answer. Diane stared at the townhouse records. "Who's Melissa?" That question landed like a grenade. The room froze. Greg opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Then the door to the private dining room opened. Every head turned. And there she was, Melissa. For a second, nobody moved. Not even Greg. The timing wasn't accidental. David had advised against surprises. Melissa ignored him. She walked calmly into the room, then sat down, right beside me. The expression on Greg's face was worth every sleepless night. I've never seen panic arrive so quickly. He looked like a man watching a bridge collapse while standing on it. Melissa spoke quietly. "I think everyone deserves the truth." Nobody interrupted. Not a single person. For the next 10 minutes, she confirmed everything. The townhouse, the promises, the lies, the overlapping relationships, the financial support. Every piece matched the documents. Every timeline aligned. There was nowhere left for Greg to hide. At one point, one of his business associates removed his glasses and simply stared at him. Another rubbed his forehead and muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Then came the moment nobody expected, including me. Greg's brother Mark started laughing. Not hysterically, not cruelly, just disbelief. "Greg?" He shook his head. "You lied to literally everybody." A few people chuckled. Then more. Even Diane. The tension broke. Not because the situation was funny, because the absurdity finally became impossible to ignore. Someone actually asked, "Is there anyone in this room you didn't lie to?" The laughter grew louder. For the first time all evening, Greg had no response. No speech, no explanation, no narrative, just silence. The performance was over, and the audience had finally seen behind the curtain. The strange thing about life-changing moments is that they rarely feel dramatic afterward. The family dinner had been explosive. The weeks that followed were mostly paperwork, phone calls, meetings, documents, deadlines, reality. A lot of reality. People often imagine that once the truth comes out, everything suddenly becomes easy. It doesn't. If anything, that's when the hard work begins. The Monday after the dinner, I sat in David Reynolds' office reviewing legal documents. The stack seemed endless. Asset disclosures, property records, retirement accounts, business valuations. Everything Greg had hoped to keep hidden was now under intense scrutiny. David looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. "He's cooperating now." I laughed. I wonder why. Fear can be very motivating. That wasn't wrong. The man who had confidently announced his divorce plans at my kitchen table now seemed desperate to settle matters quickly. His attorney certainly was. Several of Greg's financial maneuvers suddenly looked much less clever under examination, especially after questions arose regarding the forged signatures. David never promised miracles. He wasn't that kind of lawyer. What he promised was fairness. And eventually that's exactly what happened. Not immediately, not easily, but eventually. The divorce process lasted several months. There were difficult days, very difficult days. Days when I questioned everything. Days when I felt embarrassed. Days when I wondered whether I should have simply walked away quietly. Those feelings surprised me. After everything Greg had done, part of me still hated conflict. Part of me still wanted peace. Then I would remember the facts, and the doubt would pass. One afternoon in June, Emily called. "Mom, hi, sweetheart. You sound happy." The comment caught me off guard. Happy? I hadn't thought about happiness in months, yet she was right. Not because my problems had disappeared, because something heavy had finally lifted. For the first time in years, I wasn't living inside someone else's version of reality. That freedom mattered more than I expected. The settlement was finalized in late summer. Fair, reasonable, nothing extravagant, no lottery-winning moment, no movie-style ending. Just an equitable division of assets built during 3 decades of marriage. Exactly what should have happened from the beginning. A few weeks later, I sold the family home. That day was harder than signing the divorce papers. Much harder. The house held 31 years of memories. Christmas mornings, birthday parties, science fair projects, family dinners, countless ordinary moments that had once seemed insignificant. I walked through every room one final time. The kitchen, the family room, the hallway where growth marks from the children still remained inside a closet. I cried a little. Then I locked the front door and moved forward. My new home was smaller, a 2-bedroom place near Dublin, Ohio. Nothing fancy, just comfortable, manageable. Mine. The first night there, I sat on the back patio with a cup of tea. No moving boxes left to unpack. No phone calls to return. Just silence. Good silence. Peaceful silence. The kind I hadn't experienced in years. A few months later, Sharon visited. She looked around and smiled. I like this place. So do I. It feels like you. That comment stayed with me, because for a long time I'd forgotten who me was. Marriage can be wonderful, but sometimes people disappear inside it. Gradually, quietly, without realizing it. After the divorce, I started rediscovering old interests. I joined a local book club, volunteered at the public library twice a week, took short trips with a group of women I'd met through church. Nothing extraordinary. Just life. Healthy, ordinary life. One Friday afternoon, while shelving donated books at the library, I caught myself laughing with another volunteer. A genuine laugh. The kind that arrives naturally. Not forced. Not polite. Real. And I suddenly realized something. Greg hadn't taken everything. Not even close. He hadn't taken my sense of humor. My friendships. My relationship with my children. My future. Those things remained untouched. In some ways, they had grown stronger. As for Greg, news traveled occasionally through mutual acquaintances. I never went looking for updates. But small towns and long social circles have a way of sharing information. His consulting business struggled. Several professional relationships disappeared after the divorce became public. Melissa moved on with her life. As far as I know, she never spoke to him again. I didn't celebrate any of that. Honestly, I didn't need to. The desire for revenge had faded long before the final paperwork was signed. Because eventually I realized something important. The most satisfying outcome wasn't watching Greg fail. It was watching myself recover. That was the victory. Not the exposure. Not the embarrassment. Not the legal settlement. Recovery. Healing. Starting over. One evening, nearly a year after Greg announced he wanted a divorce, I found myself looking through old photo albums. There were hundreds of pictures. Some painful, some beautiful, some both. And instead of feeling anger, I felt gratitude. Not for what happened. Never that. But for what I learned. Strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like gathering documents when you're scared. Sometimes it looks like asking difficult questions. Sometimes it looks like walking away from someone you once trusted because staying would cost too much. If you're listening to this story today and you're facing your own difficult chapter, I hope you remember something I almost forgot. It is never too late to rebuild. It is never too late to protect yourself. And it is never too late to discover that you're stronger than you believed. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who might need a little encouragement today. Sometimes hearing that another person made it through can make all the difference.